Welcome to another episode of Capital Ideas, where we celebrate the ideas that make our lives better and the capital markets that make them happen. I'm Nick Morgan. I'm the founder of ICAN, the Investor Choice Advocates Network, and the co-host with Dara of Capital Ideas. Welcome.
Welcome, everyone, and I'm Dara Albright. I'm the co-host of Capital Ideas and a proud board member of ICAN. And today, please join us in welcoming David Duccini to today's episode. David is the CEO at Silicon Prairie Capital Partners, a modern investment bank that is inspired by investment crowdfunding and uses blockchain-based solutions, which, David, I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about that. And maybe you could start with talking a little bit about how you use blockchain solutions in your platform.
Thanks for asking. Really appreciate the opportunity to share some of our experiences and insights in the space. So the reality is that the blockchain-based implementation of distributed ledger technology for us is really going to be a transformative, powerful platform for secondary sales. So during the primary raises, at least on our platform, all of our offerings are conducted in US dollars using regular bank accounts, wire, ACH, checks, etc. And then once the raise has concluded, it gets kicked over to an SEC reporting transfer agent, which we also happen to operate an SEC reporting transfer agent. That's where the transfer agent manages essentially the cap table for the company, at least the list of the beneficial owners. And that's where we think is the right control place to put this technology. Now, we think that using blockchain-based distributed ledger technology in concert with a transfer agent, in concert with potentially an alternative trading system or an exchange, for instance, we could facilitate, the closest thing to a decentralized DeFi platform using things like multi-sig wallets, which I'm happy to go into. But the point is that we think that the technology is going to essentially really kind of disrupt in a meaningful way the legacy Wall Street apparatus. I think that what's interesting about using that technology is that you have essentially instant transparency into the total number of shares issued, versus just authorized. And also, I think what's kind of going to be clever is that, much like now when we get, the 8K filings that, an insider beneficial owner made some sort of transaction, now on chain, I believe that those beneficial owners, the directors and officers, will have their public keys identified so that we will all know the instant any kind of transaction, either on a buy or a sell happens, versus waiting, weeks or months to wait for the report to hit Edgar.
Yeah, exactly. So now Silicon Prairie was recently approved to operate an ATS earlier this year. So what successes has the ATS enabled for you?
Thanks so much for asking. It was a labor of love. It took 2 years going back and forth between SEC and FINRA to get it to the point where it is today, basically to the starting line. The reality is that the engine has been built for many years. We've actually designed the engine to support things like digital assets. It's elastic in terms of the types of currencies it can support. For instance, Japanese yen doesn't have a decimal place. Bitcoin goes down to 8 decimal places. Some cryptocurrencies go down to 10 decimal places. So the engine itself is essentially built, and we are onboarding our first regulation crowdfunding client who has done previous raises in the past. And so typically with most of these exemptions, the securities have to be held for a full calendar year before they're eligible to be transferred, subject to a few exemptions back to the company, to a family member, or potentially to an accredited investor. And so the reality is that we're really just in the process of crawl, walk, running here as we bring this client onto our transfer agent, which is a critical part of our model for our ATS, so that we have to have the transfer agent in the loop to act as essentially as the gatekeeper, if you will. And so we believe that we'll start facilitating secondary sales, in Q1 of next year. But the good news is that this particular issuer has, I think, just over 3,500 shareholders, and we're now onboarding our second issuer, which has about 5,500 shareholders. So both of these groups have done like at least 3, possibly 4 regulation crowdfunding offerings in the last 3 to 4 years, and so many of those early investors are essentially seasoned, if you will, and would be eligible to facilitate, secondary sales if they want to. Now, in our model, there's no market maker, which means there's no guaranteed standby order to acquire those shares. It's really more of a matchmaking service. And so when it comes to, what's the price going to be at, there's the old adage, the worth of a thing is the price it'll bring. And so I've literally talked to people in their 70s that are like, I invested in this stupid muffler shop and I'm going to die holding the bag. Like, I would take 50 cents on the dollar to get out of the pig, right? And so we think that having some path to liquidity is going to be very meaningful for many of these investors. In fact, we kind of joke around Silicon Prairie and we say an investment without an exit is just a donation.
I love it. Well, that sounds exciting, and I'm glad to see it developing, David. You mentioned getting the ATS approval was a labor of love, and that brings up an issue that we talk about a lot at ICAN, which is regulatory barriers. Can you talk a little bit about some of the regulatory barriers that you've faced?
Yeah, sure. How much time do you have? Our first regulatory challenge was actually in Minnesota. Our state-based exemption here only allowed our funding portal to charge fixed fees, so we couldn't charge a success fee. So we applied to become a state-based broker-dealer, which the state didn't even know we could do. And then we actually got an effective registration, which they violently denied. And then, 9 months later, we're going to an administrative hearing where they're trying to shut us down. And in the end, we registered a federal broker-dealer on the condition that we would go ahead and withdraw our state-based exemption. So that was our first kind of, cutting our teeth, if you will, with regulatory nonsense. After that, because I have a deep background in blockchain, the FINRA side kind of dragged us out on our funding portal for, 90 days, 120 days, until I threatened to get on an airplane and come out and see them, which I did, by the way. And then suddenly it's kind of hard to demonize someone when you can sit in the same room with them. And so we became fast friends back in 2018. And then we started the process immediately to file for an ATS. All right. So the very first company I formed was Silicon Prairie Portal on Exchange, not Silicon Prairie Portal and hold forever until you die. Right. That's a terrible name for a business. So we filed the ATS form ATS with the SEC, and immediately began doing what's called a continuing membership application with FINRA. And FINRA in theory has 60 days to get their act together. And then we got down to the 6 months to up to 180 days. And then we get down to day 175, and we hadn't really heard anything from them during this whole time. And they reached out and said, hey, can you ask us for an extension? I'm like, well, that seems kind of weird. Why am I supposed to ask you for an extension? You're the ones who are supposed to get your job done in a reasonable amount of time. And that then set up a month after month after month. I mean, so we went on for 23 months with FINRA. Meanwhile, we're trying to get the SEC, because if you go look at the form, regulation ATS is not a registration. It literally says in the law, the letter of the law is you file the form, and you can actually file it after the fact. And we couldn't get anybody at the SEC to pay attention. And so finally, we're going back and forth with FINRA, and they are just, they're just marginally competent at best. And so finally, we had to threaten to sue them in federal court for tortious interference in interstate commerce, which got their attention. And then we demanded to have access to what's called their National Adjudication Council, and literally nobody there could tell us how to do that. I'm like, where is the intake form for this thing? And I'm looking, and there's well, we don't really know. I'm like, okay, so do you want me to go on LinkedIn and contact all the people named on your NAC? And so we were able to expose that the NAC at FINRA was a total sham. And then finally, we reached out to our legislative representative, Betty McCollum, who then, through their own channels to the SEC, got the SEC to wake up. And when the SEC took a look at what FINRA was doing, they were not happy. They dressed them down pretty hard. So FINRA was trying desperately to force us to become what's called a 250K net cap broker dealer. That's one that can hold funds and securities. Look, we've created this decentralized system. We don't hold the funds or the securities. We can stay as a nickel BD. And then they kept going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And so finally, SEC said, all right, so first of all, FINRA, why didn't you tell them they could be 100 net cap BD? And they're like, I don't know. I guess we forgot about that. And then finally, in the end, we were able to push the button through. And part of it was, in fact, that FINRA was going to have a firm grouping event in Florida. I'm like, I'm going to come to Florida. I'm going to see you and look in your sweet, dumb faces and find out what the hell's going on with you guys. And I did. I flew down there, and their CEO, Robert Cook, chicken shitted out and didn't show up for the event. Because I'm like, I'm going to see Bob in his face and ask him what the fuck is going on with your firm. So FINRA has been, I would say, the biggest thorn in our side, mainly because they're not really well equipped to deal with, I would call, young, disruptive, digital-based businesses. Certainly not in the funding portal side of things. And so it's been really challenging. In fact, I've had a conversation with Commissioner Pierce at the Blockchain Stampede in Wyoming last month, and asked her, I'm like, look, so the laws say that a broker-dealer has to belong to an SRO. It doesn't say that we have to belong to FINRA. And she's like, you're right, that's absolutely true. I'm like, so are you saying there is room for another SRO? And she's like, the exchange, so the commission, would welcome, any application, for it to accept another SRO. And there's been some talk about that FINRA is ill-equipped to deal with, digital securities, and that, it might be time to bring about a new self-regulatory organization for certainly the nickel BDs, because again, that's the bulk of the BDs, the ones that FINRA hates the most, and don't really generate enough fee revenue for them. But they're just ill-equipped. Like they will just like seize up if you mention the word blockchain or distributed ledger. And like I said, they've got the ability to sit on their hands for months and months and months. And so the people at the SEC have actually, so far from my perspective, they've been great. They've actually been intellectually curious, which is a trait I can work with. The people at FINRA were like, well, we can't comment. I was like, you can't comment because you don't know. And by the way, if you're telling me I can't do that, then these five firms over here can't do it. Or, if they can do it, then I can do it. So which is it?
Right. Wow. That's an amazing story.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad it had a happy ending so far. So
yeah, so far, right. I mean, that's why I think we shared out that there's a pending lawsuit working its way up that is could be what they call the headshot for FINRA, and that it's very similar to the one with the SEC that firms have a right to due process, and that these little kangaroo courts that these agencies run with their administrative law judges are often fraught with conflicts of interest. And so I'm very excited to see, because I think this would eviscerate most of the mall cop attitude that FINRA takes.
yeah, and that's one of several cases making that same point about FINRA and whether FINRA is constitutionally organized. So I guess we'll see how those turn out. In the meantime, I'm super excited for your business model. I'm glad it's working out, and we really thank you for coming on Capital Ideas. And Dara, thank you as well. And for everyone else, if you want more information about ICAN, you can go to www.icanlaw.org, and we'll see you on the next Capital Ideas.